would suggest this, though, for the future. We're going to have to be a lot braver and a lot more courageous in standing up for our Judeo-Christian culture.
Is Christianity essential to liberty in the West?
I mean, if people really lived like Christians, it would be probably a better place for most folks.
Without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. And by difficult, I mean impossible.
I'm not saying believe in Christianity because that'll save Western civilization. But incidentally, just by the way, it will save Western civilization.
Is Christianity essential to liberty in the West? You know, it's interesting. I saw President Donald Trump actually make a statement that religion and Christianity are missing from the culture. And he says we need to bring religion back into the culture.
Religion and Christianity are the biggest things missing from this country. And I truly believe that we need to bring them back, and we have to bring them back fast. I think it's one of the biggest problems we have. That's why our country is going haywire. We've lost religion in our country. All Americans need a Bible in their home.
Now, I appreciate what he's saying, so don't get me wrong here. But first of all, we need to understand is there is no non-religious position. Everyone has a religion. Everyone has a worldview. Now, when he says we need religion and Christianity back in the culture, he really means we need the Christian religion. We really need Christianity. Because what's happened is our culture has been pervaded by the religion of secular humanism. Atheism is a religion. Secular humanism is a religion. It's a belief that man determines right and wrong, that man decides what's good and what's evil. Now, what you really mean too when you say we need to get Christianity back into the culture, we need to get the Bible back into the culture. Because here's the point, Christianity is based on God's word, and the Bible actually in Genesis 1 to 11 gives us a history that's foundational to everything and the basis for all of our doctrines, the basis for marriage, being a man and a woman, the basis for gender. And so my point is this, that if you're not on about the Bible as the foundation for our thinking, then ultimately anything goes. That's why Judges 21:25 says, when there was no king, no absolute authority, everyone did what is right in his own eyes. So it's not that we need to bring religion back into the culture. We need to bring Christianity based on the Bible back into the culture, because the Bible is the foundation for our whole worldview, for everything as a Christian. And that's why when people talk about, we need traditional family values, that's just an opinion, unless you say because there's an absolute authority God, and based on his word, we know that the family consists of a man and a woman, because God made marriage one man for one woman, and he made the first family when he made Adam and Eve. But if you're just talking about traditional family values, just an opinion. That's one of the reasons why we've seen administrations come in and they will change the rules in regard to abortion and gender one way, another one comes in, they change it this way, and then they change it back that way, then they change it this way. And the reason is because if you're not founded on God's word, then ultimately anything goes. And so really, in essence, it's not traditional family values we want, it's God's word that we need, which is why it's a reminder to Christians. Legislation ultimately is not the answer. A new administration is ultimately not the answer when it comes to politics. Government is not ultimately the answer. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important who's in government, and we need more and more Christians with a Christian worldview to be in government, to make right decisions and so on. So don't get me wrong, we need that. But ultimately the answer is God's word and the saving gospel. Because until people trust God's word, build their thinking on God's word, trust Christ for salvation, have a true Christian worldview, then they're not going to adhere to a Christian morality, which is what people really mean when they say traditional values.
The nation state also needs Christian morality. Or in the case of Israel, the morality of the Torah.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people want to see Christian morality in the culture. They want the benefits of Christian morality. But we've got to understand something. You can only have Christian morality if you believe God's word, and you have God's word, the Bible, and you can only have that if you believe in a literal Genesis 1 to 11, because that's the foundation for everything, for all doctrine, for our worldview, for everything. And so it's interesting how people recognize we need Christian morality, because if you don't have an absolute morality, the absolute morality of Christianity, then anything goes. So they need the absolute morality of Christianity, but we need to help people understand you can't have that without believing in the absolute authority, the God of the Bible, believing in His Word, and believing in Genesis 1 to 11, which is the foundation for everything.
Every successful nation has to be based on more than a constitution and a body of law. There must be transcendental stories that unites citizens to an ethical as well as legal code. For the West, that was the Judeo-Christian story of the Bible. The biblical understanding of human sinfulness inspired the concept of limited state power or rule of law, emphasizing checks and balances to prevent tyranny.
Here again, it's great to be able to hear someone say, look, we had the Judeo-Christian ethic permeating the culture, which is why the majority agreed on what's right, what's wrong, what marriage is, what gender is, and so on. But when you talk about, these stories, it's almost like, yeah, these are just stories. The word story today means fairy tale. It doesn't mean history, by and large. And that's what atheists say. Atheists say, oh, the Bible's just a book of stories. And when you hear someone say, oh, yeah, we need the stories from the Bible. No, we got to emphasize the history in the Bible and the history in Genesis 1 to 11. This is real history that's foundational to everything. So let's understand what people are talking about is the need for Christian morality, which comes from Christianity, which is based on the Bible, which is not a book of stories, it's a book of history. And the foundational history in Genesis 1 to 11 is the foundation for our morality, for our doctrine, for everything. In other words, people need to build their thinking on God's word beginning in Genesis. That's the answer.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down. And I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy certainly if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Richard Dawkins is an ardent atheist, but he wants the benefits of Christianity because of the Christian worldview, because of Christian morality, because then we have an absolute of knowing what's right and what's wrong because God defines that. So he wants the benefit of Christianity, but he says he's not a believer. He doesn't believe the Bible, doesn't believe in God. Well, if you don't believe the Bible, you have no basis for your Christian morality. But actually he sees the importance of Christian morality. So he's totally inconsistent, but that is who he is. He's an atheist. And so for him, saying he's a cultural Christian, we need that in the culture, that's his opinion. That's all it is. That's just like saying, we want traditional Christian values in the culture. Well, why? Because I think they're best. I like them the best. Well, that's just your opinion. What if somebody else comes in and says, we don't want traditional Christian values? And in fact, he talks about we don't want to be replaced by another religion. Well, we already have been. The religion of atheism, his religion, secular humanism, is permeating the culture. And what he needs to understand is what's happened in the West and the decline of the West morally is because the religion of atheism that he promotes in a big way has been indoctrinated to generations of students in our public schools, and now they're acting in a worldview consistent with that. Richard Dawkins is totally inconsistent. He holds to the foundation there's no God, but wants to cling to Christian morality. Totally inconsistent. So why is the Christian worldview collapsing in America? Well, watch this video to find out more.